Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Razan Pereira. The British press focused too much on negative stories about India. India's High Commissioner in London Y.K. Sinha said at an event in Parliament in February this year. The issue is not limited to just the UK. India has received a lot of negative press internationally over the recent past. A media watch group, Reporters Without Borders, on the 4th of July expressed serious concern at what it called an alarming deterioration in the working environment of journalists in India and demanded that the government ensure the safety of journalists who are feeling threatened. The same group in May this year ranked India 138th in the world on the Press Freedom Index, only one rank above Pakistan. Earlier in March, a UN-based report ranked India 133rd on the World Happiness Index, lower than Pakistan and China. And more recently, exactly 2 weeks ago, Thomson Reuters declared that India is the most dangerous country for women in the world. Why? And what is the perception of the foreign media about India? That's what we will discuss on this edition of The Big Picture. Joining me on the program today are Jeffrey Gettleman, South Asia Bureau Chief, The New York Times, Carol Dieterich, Foreign Correspondent, RTL Radio, and S. Venkat Narayan, India Bureau Chief, The Island, Sri Lanka. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. I'd like to start the program with the lady first. Carol, over the recent past, India has been ranked the worst, or probably one of the worst, on several indexes. Why is that so?
We don't do, as media, we don't do the ranking. And I think in general, there is more to reality than just a ranking. But it's something that we should, that when we deal with, I think we should look at it closely. And I think, at least, I'm speaking from the French perspective as I'm French. I think the French media do it quite critically because, like, for example, you were speaking about the Thomson Reuters Foundation ranking, which ranked India like the most dangerous place for women. So we have to look closely what they are measuring, and we have to look, I think, critically about that. So it's a survey. As
a foreign correspondent, a woman in India,
yes.
Do you feel insecure?
Well, that is only my feeling. I feel insecure, but I also feel insecure. I can also feel insecure in Paris. It's a different kind of insecurity. And also, I think as we all sit here, we all live, I think, a privileged life. So it's probably a different kind of insecurity I might feel as a woman living a privileged life here than other women in India. But I also feel insecure in Paris. That is true. But going back to that survey, I think it's a survey. They've asked their opinion to 500 experts on specific topics. So there is a subjective part to it, but there is also a reality lying behind those rankings. And if you look at the figures in India, you look at the National Crime Records Bureau figures, what they say is that the crimes against women have actually increased between 2012 and 2016. And I think it's around...
But the same is the case with the UK, the same is the case with the United States as well.
True, it is very true, but that's why we have to look at it. And if those figures have increased, it's also because those crimes get better reported and that get reported, which is actually a positive thing. So I think it is important to report on those rankings, but let's keep in mind what they measure and let's contextualize. Because I think it's one thing to say like India is the worst, but why? What has been measured? What have we asked to those people? And also if there are figures, what do they say and in which context?
Sure. Jeffrey?
Yes, sir.
Why the negative press? Why so much negativity when it comes to India? India is not all bad. India is not all cows roaming on the streets, as it is very fondly known abroad. So why so much negative press, really?
Well, I appreciate you asking me and inviting me on today. News is generally negative. Our business, the news business, focuses on the dramatic, the extreme. We don't write about the countless families that are raising their children in good ways and are doing it sort of quietly and responsibly. We write about the families that abuse their kids or the people who commit crimes. That's what news is. News is not necessarily a presentation of all sides. It's a deliberate focus on exceptions to the norm.
So news by nature is biased, is what you're suggesting?
No, I didn't use the word biased. It's just selective.
Okay.
It's selective.
Okay.
And so, as a journalist, I was recently working in Africa. I've worked in conflict zones in Afghanistan and Iraq. Most of the world is not at war. Most of the world is not killing each other. But often the picture we get from looking at our news is about these very sad and disturbing incidents. And there's something in human nature that people are vicariously drawn to or titillated by reading about disaster. For instance, like weather, we don't write about, you know, a beautiful, calm, sunny day. We write about a horrific storm or a hurricane or floods, right? We don't you know, catalog every day the smooth, uneventful weather. We focus on the dramatic weather. Does that mean we have some, you know, bias against, you know, good weather? No, it's that people are affected by dramatic weather and they're interested in what happens when things are abnormal.
Right. S. Venkat Narayan, I'm going to go back to the Thomson Reuters Foundation report about ranking India as the most dangerous country for women in the world. Should organizations like Thomson Reuters, other organizations that actually carry out some of these reports, carry out some of these studies, be far more responsible when it comes to gathering data?
You know, I would say what Jeffrey said. You see, when they teach you in journalism schools that when a dog bites man, that's no news. But when a man bites a dog, that is news. You see? Now, if you open any newspaper or watch any TV channel in India, it's full of news which you may think is bad news. It does not reflect very well on India. That may be so. So, you know, if I am a reporter reporting on India, you have to report what is going on in that country. And it's the business of the government and government's spokesman to reach out to the media to explain if something happens. It's not enough for the Prime Minister to put out a tweet. I would expect the spokesperson of the Government of India, the PIO or the JSXP, to reach out to the media and explain the context and try to put forward the Government of India's position.
Is that not happening now?
I'm afraid it's not happening at all, I'm sorry to say. Even the Foreign Minister of India, she hardly gives any interviews. The Prime Minister of the world's largest democracy, you never get to see him giving an interview on television. And Sushma Swaraj insists on speaking in Hindi at an annual press conference. So you never get to see an Indian leader articulating India's position on any global issues in the English language. You have 76 ministers in the Council of Ministers. I'm sorry to say that not one of them goes to the Foreign Correspondents Club or meets foreign journalists or grants interviews when the foreign correspondents ask them and explain the country's position.
Is that a grouse?
It is not a grouse, it is a hard reality. If the Government of India and the people of India are upset about getting a bad press, it's up to the government to do something about it.
Will that help in changing the perception of India?
You bet it will. You bet it will.
Carol, let's talk about the Western media and its biases towards India, because something that I raised with Jeffrey as well. You know, in the past we've seen, you know, press is pretty much always negative when it comes to India. India was successfully sent an orbiter to Mars. We are sending a mission to Moon, an excavatory mission to Moon. I don't see any of that in the foreign media.
Well,
that is also news at the end of the day.
If you take us to the moon with you, we'll definitely cover it.
Well, I don't think Western media are biased towards India, and as Jeffrey was saying before, it's in general, it's inherent to our job. And in France, actually, people tend to tell journalists who are reporting on France, but you guys always report on that train which arrived late, but you never report on that train which arrived on time. And I think it's exactly the same. It's not directed towards India. It's not directed against India. It's the way we do our job again. But then also maybe sometimes what could be, I don't know, we have to be careful about stereotyping. I don't think they are biased against India, but sometimes maybe we have to be careful not to stereotype a complicated society when you have to explain it to a large audience, which frankly doesn't know a lot about it, because that's our job and it's very difficult. But also stereotyping can be positive, and it is problematic as well. And I don't think there is any, I mean, there is not any negative news directed. It's not like specific to India, definitely not. But then maybe you get like a kind of magnifying effect, because like the international space, like the space for international news in the French media, for example, in most of the French media, is very little. And then within the space for international news, the space for India is even smaller. So then, you know, you speak about India once in a while. So yeah, of course, if you pick that news about like India being the most dangerous country in the world, it can seem like, oh wow, that's very negative. But then if you go beyond the headline as well, you will see that actually there is this deconstruction
but how many people
process.
actually go beyond the headline?
Well, if it's a good headline, they'll read it.
You know, let's talk about the perception of India in the Western media. What is the perception like?
God, that's a huge question. I think people are fascinated by this country. I think they don't understand it that well. Americans are very self-centered, inward-looking, which is kind of ironic because it's a nation of immigrants. But that's you know, the U.S. is a huge country geographically, population-wise, and so you just a lot of Americans are not paying attention to what's happening outside of the U.S., especially now when there's so much turbulence within the U.S. political system. So, what does like the guy on the street in the U.S. think of India? I think people see it as a very dynamic country that's changing a lot. I think people associate India with great poverty. I think people also associate India with professionals, technology, because there are millions of Indians outside of India, and many of them are doing quite well as doctors and tech industry, business, finance. So a lot of Americans have that experience with these very educated, professional, successful Indians. So they think, oh wow, well India must be producing that. I think people also associate India with very interesting rituals, religion, culture, fashion, food. And in the U.S., almost every town has, you know, an Indian restaurant at this point. And people, you know, that have never set foot in this country enjoy eating Indian food, getting a little taste of the culture, so to speak. So our jobs are really difficult because on one hand, we are journalists. We are focusing on the dramatic, on the extreme, like we've been saying. But on the other hand, we want to present a picture of this place that we're all drawn to. You know, I chose to come here. I'm sure she did too. And we want to translate and decode India. It has to be simplified because we're given 500 words, 800 words, 1,000 words.
Since you said that you've come to India now, you were in Africa before this. Was it the job title that brought you here? What is it that brought you here?
No, well, it wasn't. Nobody really cares about my job title. What brought me here was that this is one of the most important countries in the world, and it's changing rapidly. And it's going to be even more influential on global affairs and on the shape of humanity in the years to come. And I saw it as a challenge. I'd been in Africa for a long time. I knew my region pretty well as a journalist. And I just thought, here is an enormous, diverse, complicated, fascinating, important country. I would be honored to try to explain it.
Interesting. Thank you. Venkat Narayan, you know, does the Western media have an obsession towards negative press on the whole?
No, I don't agree with that, actually. You see, you know, if you look yourself in the mirror, if your face is not so nice looking, you cannot blame the mirror. See, the West has a free press. You know, their reporters, you know, do the best they can to travel around the region which they are covering and so on and so forth. Let me talk about one specific thing. You know, we sent a mission to the moon. We sent more than 100 satellite, you know, these things, in a particular, this thing from Sriharikota. If I was dealing with the media in the government of India, I would take a bunch of foreign media to Sriharikota or show our science facilities in Bengaluru or take them to Odisha and just see what is happening. This used to happen in a big way when Rajiv Gandhi was the Prime Minister. After that, I'm afraid nobody is doing anything.
So the lack of media junkets really is the problem.
No, I won't call it a junket. An individual journalist, if we ask for, access, they say, no, this is a defense area. No, you cannot go into this. It is impossible to reach out to a minister or even a senior official in the government, which is ridiculous. See, when a New York Times reporter is writing about subject X and he wants a quote from somebody, people should give him that quote. Full stop. I'm afraid the ministers and bureaucrats in this government seem to think that if somebody asks to speak to them, by granting that meeting, they are doing a favor. That's wrong. So provide access to the foreign media. The Foreign Correspondents Club has a huge air-conditioned auditorium where 100 people can be seated. And it is open. One has invited so many ministers. I'm afraid very few of them have taken the trouble of coming. And you go to foreign ministry briefings, most of the briefings are in Hindi. So people who don't understand Hindi don't bother to go. How can you complain? So they pick it up from whatever comes out in the local papers, English papers.
Sure. Carol, I'm just going to come to you for a reaction. But before that, Jeffrey, is that a similar problem that you face as well? Lack of access, do you believe, is a big problem?
I think, yeah, I do. I often, for instance, one of the first stories I did was about that toilet movie that was emphasizing and spotlighting issues about open defecation. I tried really hard to get information about how many toilets have been built, where were they, how's that program going, and I spoke, and people in my office spoke to several bureaucrats, and we tried to speak to higher-ups in the government about this program that they're clearly proud of. Very few, if anybody, would return our calls, return our
Why
emails.
is that so, do you think?
I think they're scared. I think they're worried that they might make a mistake in speaking to us, or they might give us information that they weren't supposed to give us. I don't know. But it was what we would call a softball. I mean, here was a story about a movie that was celebrating this effort in India to change something that, talk about perceptions. The government here is really trying to change that perception of India as backward and India as dirty. And they think that there's very important, hygiene and welfare and development issues connected to it. It's not just about perception. And here we were spending a lot of time trying to get just very basic facts. How many toilets, how much, where, when, and nobody would give them to us.
Is it easier in other Asian countries or African countries to get that information out?
No, it's not. I think it's easier in Western countries. But my experience is a lot of developing countries are, they don't have the same value of sharing the information with the public. I'm not asking them to give me, the New York Times, or me, Jeffrey Gettleman, the information. We're going to broadcast that. We're going to print 1 million newspapers. We're going to put that out on the internet. We're just asking us to be the vehicle for what we think is interesting or important, and then the public will get that information. It's not about me. It's about informing the public. And that's what Venkat's saying. If you want to show the world that you have a very interesting and dynamic space program, give people access to that space program. If you want to show the world you're making progress on sanitation issues, be really fast and eager to share that information. It was the opposite. It was like we were trying to uncover some scandal, and that wasn't the intent at all, and I made that very clear.
And be innovative as well.
Yeah.
Carol, I'm going to go back to a point that Venkat made. You spoke about freedom of the press, and he said how the Western press is far more freer, maybe, than the press here. Is that really the case? Because if you look at the Western media as well, it's all controlled by business tycoons. So at the end of the day, is the Western press also that free?
Well, it depends what you're looking at. Actually, it really depends what you're looking at when you speak about the freedom of press. And I think in the ranking of Reporter Without Borders, they look at specific things as well. And I think I'm sorry, I don't know. I mean, I'm not working as an Indian journalist, and even if you are a foreign correspondent in India, I think it is a bit different. But the thing I'm sure is there are companies who have interest in the French media. That's pretty much evident. But I don't think there are any journalists that have been killed in France over the past year. And that's a huge difference. And I don't think journalists get that much harassed when they publish something that someone doesn't like. They don't get harassed that way. And even if you look at the private interest in France, there are actually safety networks to protect journalists from those like commercial interest in their newspaper, which I feel here is not that strong. So there are differences. Obviously, there is no perfect situation. But in France, I think reporters do not fear for their life.
Okay. Yeah.
Can I just add one point, which is we're in a business. Like I'm sitting here 10,000 miles away from my home office. That costs money. It costs money to send me on trips. It costs money to support an office. That's a commitment to different parts of the world. We think that they're important and that Americans and other people should know about India or know about Africa, but that costs money. So the fact that there are people making money or journalism is tied to business, that's a reality. There are a few public broadcasters. There's no public newspaper. So I don't have a problem with business interests investing in journalism. I think it's what you do with your investment in the media, not just the fact that you are a business getting involved in media.
I'm going to go back to a point that Carol was making about how maybe the journalists are not that safe in India as compared to France because of the safeguards that are there in place in France. But let's not also forget that the journalists here also do things that they're not supposed to at the end of the day, cutting deals under the table. When you play with fire, you're going to get burnt. So you also have to consider that at the end of the day, Jeffrey.
I guess. I mean, I haven't seen anybody playing with fire. What I've seen is people that are persecuted and threatened for what they write. And it's not just in India.
No, but at the same time, you have editors, you have everyone else who are criticizing the government and criticizing certain political parties and still surviving and thriving in the country.
Yeah, listen, I've worked in very repressive countries in Africa and other places where there was, India is got a very vibrant and extensive media scene. There's tons of channels on TV and newspapers. So I think there are some issues, there are some threats, but there are many countries that are a lot worse, where there's almost no independent media. India has countless independent media, but there's some issues here with rule of law. Some people feel like if they criticize a powerful entity, whether that's a person or a group that has a lot of power, that they could be in personal danger. I think that's a rule of law issue. I think in the West you have a little tighter rule of law. You see it in many different ways. It's manifested in many different ways. So if anybody who threatened a journalist was thrown in jail for threatening to kill somebody and then was prosecuted and punished, there would be fewer people doing that. And I think that's just an issue with many countries, that they don't have as tight a rule of law.
Closing comments now from all my guests, starting with you, Venkat, first, of course. What's the way forward? How do we remedy the situation?
Well, I think the remedy is that you have to make people at large realize, not just the foreign media, that the rule of law operates in this country. And the government should be more accessible to the media, Indian as well as foreign. It's very, very important for Indian leaders to be seen on television networks across the globe. It's very, very important for politicians and ministers and prime minister to be giving interviews or to be quoted by the top newspapers in the world. That is possible only when they provide access. And it will be possible only when they get rid of the feeling that by granting an interview to a Carol or Gettleman, they are doing a favor to the New York Times or the radio in France. They should change the mindset and provide access, make a conscious effort to reach out to the media. That is the only way of making sure that India is shown in the light perspective in the global media.
Carol?
I would say that there is no bias against India in the Western media. There is, instead, I would say, a growing interest. And see it, we are here and there are many other foreign journalists in India, so there is an interest. But yes, we need access, and we also do not see us as a threat, or I think quite the contrary. I think we're here to report on that country, to understand, to make it understand, to make like a complicated country understood to a large audience in our home country. So I think we could that's a way of taking things forward.
Talking about your home country, what's the perception of India in your home country, France?
First, I think French people most of the French people don't know much about India, I think. But there is a growing interest. I mean, you can definitely see it, because I think India more and more is seen as a potential commercial, economic and strategical partner for France. And you can see it when Emmanuel Macron came here for a state visit. There were so many French journalists coming from Paris to follow that visit, and in the press it was everywhere. So there is a growing interest, and I think people are very they have expectations, because for them India is this huge country of 1.3 billion people. It's a democracy, so they are looking at India more like in a curious way, because they have expectations. And it's also, when Donald Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement, India was there when Emmanuel Macron said, like, let's make planet great again. So people are actually looking at India.
Okay, people are looking towards India and are
Yes.
curious about India,
Yes.
is what the panelists are suggesting. Jeffrey, please close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Well, I just would like to say we're very lucky to have these jobs. I get to travel for my work. I get to see new cultures, see new places. We really trade off people's trust. You know, how many times have I walked into a village and just asked somebody to comment on a topic or to talk to me, and they take time out of whatever they're doing to speak to us? We're lucky. We get a free pass to talk to anybody, to go anywhere that we think is interesting. So that's the root of my interest in journalism. It's not to sort of have an agenda or an ideology. It's to explore. And if we're doing a good job, that's what we're sharing. We're sharing our...
And we as journalists should be far more responsible, do you think?
I think everybody should be more responsible. but yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I think we all try very hard to be careful and to be respectful and to be fair. I think if you do those things, then you're doing a pretty good job as a journalist.
All right, on that note then, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to the three of you for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.